Welcome back to Paper Cuts, folks. And, sorry about, we kind of had a false start yesterday, and then I realized I had much less energy than I thought. But we're off to a much better start now. And, last we left off, our intrepid hero, Dirk, saw a huge mass of some sort in the sky. We're not exactly sure what it is, but he flew over to someone's house to figure out what the heck's going on. And last we left off, Dirk noticed that Stanton's plane was there, and we're about to find out a little bit more about Stanton. So let us begin. Yes, Dirk, he arrived here 3 or 4 minutes before you did. I thought at first it was you that was showing up, and Dirk, he flew up to look at that thing, and I know he's as frightened about it as I am, she continued with a note of excitement in her voice. Dirk grunted, but he gave no expression of the dislike and distrust that Stanton aroused in him. The latter, he knew, was very much inclined to look with favor on Inga, and his presumption annoyed Dirk because, while he and the girl had not declared their intention of living together, they were very much in love with each other. You will want to hear him tell about it. I know you will. I left Stanton up on the garden terrace when I saw you coming down. We'll go and join him. Dirk and Inga strolled slowly along paths which were lined with exotic shrubbery and plants. Here and there a fountain tossed its glittering spray high into the air, while birds, invisible in the feathery foliage, warbled and thrilled entrancingly. Soft music, transmitted from the auditoriums below, blended so harmoniously with the atmosphere of the terraces that it seemed to mingle with and be a part of the drifting, subtle sense of the abundant flowers which bloomed on every side. For these upper terraces of Fragoni's palace were enclosed during inclement weather with great glass plates which, with the touch of a button, automatically appeared or disappeared. Winding their way easily upward, Dirk and Inga came finally to a secluded terrace which overlooked the sound. Here they saw Stanton, who was unaware of their approach, looking skyward at the dim and sinister shape which was outlined against the sky. Stanton's brow was contracted, and his expression was filled with apprehension. He started suddenly when he became conscious of the presence of Dirk and the lovely daughter of Fragoni. He rose to his feet, a short man in his 40s, stocky in build and somewhat swarthy in complexion. He contrasted very unfavorably with Dirk, who was tall and well-built and had abundant blonde hair and steady steel-blue eyes.
What do you make of that thing, Vanderpool?
I don't know enough about it yet to be able to express an opinion. We'll find out about it soon enough, so why worry about it in the meantime?
It's well enough to affect such an attitude,
said Stanton with a touch of sarcasm in his voice.
But let me tell you, Vanderpool, there's good reason to worry about it.
Dirk frowned at the statement as he saw a shadow pass over the fair face of Inga.
That thing up there is not a natural phenomena. I flew fairly close to it in my plane, and I know what I'm speaking about. That thing is some sort of a monster, Vanderpool. It's made of metal or some composition which is an unearthly equivalent of metal. It's a diabolical creation of some sort that's come from out of the fathomless depths of the universe.
He shuddered at the fantasy his feverish imagination was creating.
It's metal, I tell you, but it's metal that's endowed with some sort of intelligence. I was up there and I saw it hanging in the sky, quivering with heat and life.
You're nervous, Stanton. Get a grip on yourself and look at the thing reasonably. If that thing has intelligence, we'll find some way to slay it.
Slay it? How can you expect to slay a mad creation that can leap through space from world to world like a wasp goes darting from flower to flower? How could you kill a thing which not only defies absolute zero, but the immeasurable heat which its friction with the atmosphere generated when it plunged towards the earth? How can you kill a thing that seems to have brains and nerves and bones and flesh of some strange substance that's harder and tougher than any earthly compound we've discovered?
He stopped speaking for a moment, and they listened to the voice that was broadcasting from within the worldwide tower. Our planes have approached to within a few thousand feet of it, and are playing their searchlights over the surface of the Leviathan. It is not a meteorite of any kind that scientists have heretofore examined. Its surface is smooth and unpitted, and shows no apparent effect of the tremendous heat to which it was subjected during its drop through the atmosphere. It seems to be immune to gravity. Its weight must be tremendous, and it is fully 3/4 of a mile long and between 700 and 800 feet in diameter at its widest part, but it lies motionless at 40,000 feet. Well, it doesn't appear now as if it's going to be very dangerous.
People are warned again to maintain their composure, and go to their homes, and remain there for their own protection and the protection of others. Riots and serious disturbances are reported from cities in all parts of the world. Mobs are swarming the streets of Manhattan and the other boroughs of New York, and the police are finding it difficult to restrain the frenzied populations in other centers.
There was a pause then of some moments, and then the voice of the broadcaster, vibrant with excitement, was heard again.
A plane has made a landing on the surface of the monstrosity, which it seems has not only lost its heat, but is becoming decidedly cold.
A servant appeared from among the shrubbery and paused before Dirk. "There is a call for you, Mr. Vanderpool," he said respectfully.
Dirk excused himself, and, entering the sumptuous apartment that opened from the terrace, went to the televisor.
He saw the face of Sears, the chief secretary of Fragoni, in the glass panel.
"There will be a meeting of the council at 9 o'clock in the morning, Mr. Vanderpool."
"Thank you, Mr. Sears. It happens that Stanton's here at the present time. Should I notify him of the conclave as well?"
"If you will, please. By the way, Mr. Vanderpool, is there anything wrong at your apartment? I tried to call you there before I located you here, and I failed to get any response."
"Well, I suppose that all of my servants have run out from under cover because of their fear in that thing in the sky. Do you know anything about it, Sears?"
"It'll be discussed at the meeting tomorrow morning. Good night, Mr. Vanderpool."
Dirk, upon returning to the terrace, saw that both Stanton and Inga were silently and fearfully looking up in the night. "There's a meeting of the council at 9 o'clock in the morning, Stanton. I told Sears I'd notify you."
"I thought that we would be called together very soon. It's concerning, that thing up there."
"Well, perhaps. I believe I'll just head home and get some sleep."
"Sleep? Sleep? On a night like this?"
"Oh, Dirk, please stay here, won't you? I'm not going to bed because I just know I won't be able to close my eyes."
"Let him go, Inga, if he wants to sleep. I'll stay here and keep watch with you."
"And if order is not restored in the streets of Manhattan within the course of a short time, the authorities will resort to morphite gas to quell the turbulence and rioting. The streets must be frightfully congested. It's the first occasion in a long time that the police have had to threaten the use of morphite. We don't want to alarm people unnecessarily, but we have to report that the monstrous mass has been hanging over the city, has just made a sudden drop of 5,000 feet and again came to a stop. It's now a little more than 6 miles over Manhattan, and again it has dropped. This time it fell like a plummet for 12,000 feet. It's now at about 20,000 feet, some 4 miles above Manhattan, and..." Suddenly a cry of alarm came from the lips of Inga as she gazed upward and saw that gigantic, ominous-looking object loom dim and vast in the darkness above them. She went to Dirk and threw her arms around him as if she were clinging to him for protection. "Don't leave me, Dirk. I can just feel that something terrible is going to happen. I want you with me." "I'll stay with you, of course." Something of that feeling of dread and apprehension which so fully possessed his two companions entered into his own mind. "Don't tremble so, Inga. It's a strange thing, but we'll know more about it in the morning. Be calm then, my dear, if you can." He looked over the shoulder of the girl, whose face was buried against his chest, and he saw 100 great red and green shafts of light shooting up into the air. Fleeting shadows seemed to pass swiftly up and down them, and he knew that thousands of planes were abroad, some of them seeking the heights, and others dropping down. The great towers of Long Island were all aglow, and it was apparent that few people were sleeping that night. The scarlet sky over Manhattan indicated the center of the metropolis as well was alive to this menace of the weird visitant that was now so plainly visible. All night long they remained on the terrace, Dirk and Inga seated close together, and Stanton at a distance, brooding alone over the disaster which he felt was impending. The illuminated dial of the great clock that was a part of the beacon tower on the Metropole landing field told of the slow passing of the hours. And all night long they listened to the reports that came through the radio visor and watched that immobile, threatening monster of steel. But it remained static through the rest of the night, and with the coming of a gray and sunless dawn, it hung there, motionless, silent, and sinister. The next morning, the President of the United States of the world, from the Capitol at The Hague, issued a proclamation of martial law to become effective at once in all parts of the world. The edict forbade people to leave their homes, and it was vigorously executed wherever the police themselves were not in a state of demoralization. At about the same time, a special meeting of the Supreme Congress was called, the body to remain in session until some solution of this mystery had been arrived at. At the time that the martial law was declared, however, the special assemblage of lawmakers convened. A statement was issued in which an attempt was made to eliminate from the minds of the people the idea that the undefinable object above the metropolis was at all dangerous. It was indeed suggested that it was probably some sort of new device which had been constructed on Earth and which was being introduced to the people of the world in a somewhat sensational manner by the person or persons who were responsible for it. The fears of the populace were, to some extent, allayed by this means, and some degree of order was restored. At 9 o'clock, Dirk Vanderpool was shown into the council chamber in the palace of Orlando Fragoni, and he was closely followed by Stanton. Fragoni was already there, and he greeted the two men with a countenance that was serene, but that nevertheless revealed indications of concern. He was a man past middle age, tall and strikingly handsome in appearance. His eyes were dark and penetrating, and his forehead, high and wide, was crowned by an abundance of snow-white hair. His voice, while pleasing to the ear, was vibrant with life and energy, and he spoke with the incisive directness of one accustomed to command. For Orlando Fragoni, as nearly as any one man might be, was the ruler of the world. It was in the early part of the 20th century that wealth had commenced to concentrate into a relatively few hands. This was followed by a period in which vast mergers and consolidations had been effected as a result of the financial power and genius for organization which a few men possessed. A confederation of the countries of the world was brought about by industrial kings who had learned in one devastating war that militarism, while it might bring riches to a few, was in the final analysis destructive and wasteful. Mankind, the world over, relieved of the menace of war, made more progress in a decade than they had made in any previous century, but all the time the invisible concentration of power and money continued. And in 1975 the affairs of the world were controlled by 5 men, of whom Orlando Fragoni was the most powerful and important. His grandfather had been a small banker, and out of his obscure transactions the great house of Fragoni had arisen. The money power of the world was now controlled by Orlando Fragoni. Dirk Vanderpool, partly as a result of a vast inheritance and partly through his own ability and untiring industry, dominated the transportation facilities of the world. Planes and zeppelins, railroad equipment and ships were built at his plants and operated by the many organizations which he controlled. Stanton had inherited the agricultural activities of the world, and in addition to this, he was the sovereign of distribution. He owned immense acreages in all of the continents, and not only cultivated every known variety of produce, but as well handled the sale of products through his own great chain of stores. His father had been one of the great geniuses of the preceding generation, Stanton, inheriting the commercial empire which he had ruled, had not inherited much of the ability which had gone into the establishment of it. There were 2 other members of that invisible council of 5, the very existence of which was not even suspected by the general populace of the world. Sigmund Lazar was the world's mightiest builder, and millions of great structures which were built of material from his own mines were under his control. It was Lazar, too, who owned the theaters and other amusement centers in which millions upon millions of people sought relaxation every day. The creation and application of electrical power made up the domain of Wilhelm Steinhold, who also owned the factories that made the machinery of the world. Absolute control of all the necessities and luxuries of life were, in fact, in the hands of the 5 men who used their vast power wisely and beneficently. Ostensibly, the peoples of the world ruled themselves by means of a democratic government. However, in reality, their lives were directed by a few men whose power and wealth were entirely unsuspected by any but those who were close to them. The council room in which Fragoni had received Dirk and Stanton was lofty and sumptuously appointed. The rugs which covered the wall were soft to the tread, and the walls and ceiling were adorned with a series of murals which represented the various heavenly constellations. At the far end of the chamber there was a staircase, and Dirk was among those who knew it led up to the great observatory in which Fragoni and certain of his scientific associates spent so much of their time at night. For men had commenced to talk about the conquest of the stars, and it was generally believed that it would not be many years more before a way would be found to traverse the interplanetary spaces.
We are rather fortunate, my friends, to have been the witnesses of an event that transpired last night.
Fragoni said to his 2 associates. Fortunate? Then how do you know this? Then you know this thing is harmless? A little smile lit the benign, scholarly countenance of Fragoni as he calmly regarded Stanton.
We know very little about it, and if our surmises are correct, it may be very far from harmless. It's intensely interesting nonetheless, because that thing, as you term it, is unquestionably directed by intelligence. Without the slightest doubt, the people of the earth are about to behold a form of life from some faraway planet. What that form will be,
he added, with an almost imperceptible shrug of his shoulders,
is impossible to forecast.
But it was so hot that...
True, but it's also large, and it may only be the outer shell that was affected by the friction with the atmosphere. In the atmosphere of the Earth, Noshbarn is certain that there is intelligent life within it, and Noshbarn is usually right.
While Fragoni had been speaking, 2 more men had quietly joined them.
Good morning, Lazar,
Fragoni said, addressing a short, swarthy man who was very apparently of Jewish descent.
Good morning,
the other replied in a soft and mellifluous voice. So he's got that very,
smooth silken voice. Good morning. It seems as if some of my pretty buildings may be toppled over soon, he continued with a twinkle in his eyes.
Maybe, and maybe much more than your buildings will be toppled over, Lazar.
That thing, then, is? Questioned the heavy-set, slow-speaking, blue-eyed Teuton, who had come into the room with Lazar.
We don't know, Steinhold, but our knowledge undoubtedly will be increased considerably within the next few hours. And now we will consider the problem at hand.
The object which has created such unrest is slowly rising. It is now some 25,000 feet above Manhattan. It is... The voice from the radio visor attracted the attention of the 5 men, and with one accord they rushed to the terrace and looked toward Manhattan. They saw the great Leviathan high in the air for a moment, and then suddenly it seemed to vanish from flight.
It's gone,
exclaimed Stanton with a sigh of relief.
It must have been some odd atmospheric freak, that's all.
They searched the skies through the lucoscope that was on the terrace, but failed to detect any trace of the monster.
Well, that seems to simplify matters,
remarked Fragoni as they again walked back into the great conference room. But here once more they heard the voice from the worldwide tower. We were advised by Chicago that the thing, dull red with heat, is hovering only a couple thousand feet over the city. Thousands in the streets are being killed by the heat it is radiating. Panic reigns despite a rigorous enforcement of martial law. The strange object just rose suddenly into a high altitude and disappeared.
It's another one of those things that couldn't go 1,000 miles a minute.
It could go faster than that if I'm not mistaken.
And it presently appeared that he was right, for in a couple minutes the radio visor transmitted the news that it was over San Francisco, where it remained for only a few seconds. It was not more than a minute later that word came from Shanghai that it had passed over that city. Then again it was poised high over Manhattan, crimson with heat.
Is there any possible defense against its giant hold?
Fragoni asked. The Chiton shook his head with an air of finality. None, as far as I can determine now. We could create and redirect artificial lightning that would reduce this building to a mass of powdered stone-infused metal in a fraction of a second, but I'm certain that it wouldn't leave as much of a scratch on that monster up there. We might try the Z-rays on it, but an intelligence that could devise such a craft would undoubtedly have the wisdom to protect it against such an elementary menace as rays. Even the mightiest explosives that we have wouldn't send a tremor through that mighty mass. Why not await developments? We're not even sure of the nature of the thing we're trying to combat.
It's solid metal. It's a metal body with a metal brain.
Don't be ridiculous. It seems quite apparent the craft has come from another planet, and if I'm not greatly mistaken, there are intelligent creatures inside it. Well, in any event, it seems impractical to make any plans until we know more about it. I suggest that we empower Fragoni to act for the rest of us in this matter.
That's very agreeable to me. A crisis may very possibly arise, in which the quick judgment of one man may be necessary to avert the danger that is always inherent in delay.
You hold... Wait, this is Lazar? Lazar's the one with the smooth voice, right? I think.
You hold my proxy, and I assume that Stanton is agreeable to this procedure.
The thing is moving very slowly eastward in the direction of Long Island... Oh, excuse me. The thing is moving very slowly eastward in the direction of Long Island Sound. It is at the same time losing altitude. Its movements are being carefully watched. As yet we see no cause for immediate alarm. People are advised to remain calm.
Yes, I'm agreeable,
said Stanton nervously and hastily.
If there are things in it with which we can compromise... If there are things in it with which we can compromise, then I would suggest we don't offend them.
I am then empowered to act for all of you,
said Fragoni, ignoring Stanton's suggestion. He rose from his chair and walked out on the terrace, and the others followed after him. Looking westward, they saw the mammoth craft. They saw the mammoth craft descending slowly in their direction. Its vast dimensions became more and more apparent as, spellbound, They watched it approach closer and closer to them. The thing in the sky was now not more than 3,000 feet above them and only a few miles to the west. The observers on the terrace regarded it for a moment in silence as it drifted forward and downward. "It's colossal," Steinholt then examined, lost in scientific admiration of the mammoth craft. "Magnificent! Superb!"
It's coming right towards us.
"What makes it move, and how in the world is it controlled?"
It's surely not of this world. That gigantic thing has come to us from somewhere out of the infinite and terrible depths of space.
Another minute elapsed while they watched it, speechless with wonder. "Do you know, I believe it's going to land in the waters of the Sound. It appears so to me, anyway." It was nearly opposite them by this time, and not more than 1,000 feet above the water. A few planes, which were very apparently being flown by intrepid and fearless flyers, were hovering close around it. Then it finally came to a rest, as Lazar had predicted, in the water, some 2 miles off the shore, and it was obscured by a great cloud of vapor for several minutes. "That steam, that trip around the world, which it made in a few minutes, generated considerable frictional heat in the shell."
But we'll fly out and look the thing over.
Around the corner of the building on the level of the terrace, there was a landing stage, which was occupied by a number of planes of various sizes. Dirk entered the door of a small 20-passenger speedster, and the others filled in for him. "Ready?" he asked after he'd seated himself at the controls.
"Ready,"
replied Fragoni. The plane rose straight up into the air and then darted gracefully out over the Sound. Dirk swooped straight down at the Leviathan, which lay so quietly on the surface of the Sound, and then slowly circled around it. No sign of an aperture of any sort could be in the craft. Then he dropped the plane lightly on the water, close to the metallic monster, which towered him up fully 400 feet above the monster, despite the fact that it was more than half of his. Despite the fact that more than half of it was submerged, rather. It must be hollow, or it certainly wouldn't be so far out of the water. In fact, it'd certainly sink if it were solid. At the touch of a lever which lay under one of Dirk's hands, the plane rose straight up out of the water, and he maneuvered it directly over the top of the strange enigma. Then he touched a button, and pontoons were drawn up into the undercarriage of the craft. "Shall I make a landing on it?" he asked, turning his head and addressing Fragoni. The latter nodded his head, and Dirk dropped the ship gently onto the smooth surface of the monster, the pneumatic gearing completely absorbing the shock of their landing. Dirk relinquished the controls, and opening the door of their cabin, stepped out into the rough and pitted surface, of the substance of which the Leviathan was compounded. He stood there while the others came out after him. A large area on the top of the monster was perfectly flat, and within a few moments, Dirk discovered that it was decidedly warm as well. He had brought the plane down close to the middle of the length of the strange craft, in the belief that if anywhere, some indication of an entrance might be found. The voice of Steinhold, tense with suppressed excitement, appraised him that his surmise had been correct. "There's a manhole of some sort, and look, it's turning." They saw, not far ahead of them, a circular 12-foot section of the deck slowly revolving, and even as they watched, it commenced to rise slowly upward, as the threads with which it was turned provided. Oh, sorry, I misread that. And even as they watched, it commenced to rise slowly upward, as the threads with which it was provided turned gradually around. Almost involuntarily, they retreated a few feet, and stood there spellbound as they stared at the massive, revolving section of deck. It continued to turn until fully 10 feet of the mobile cylinder had been exposed, and then the bottom of it appeared. Even then it continued to revolve and rise in a comparatively small shaft which supported it, and at the same time thrust it upward. Dirk and his companions kept their eyes on the rim of the well, which had been exposed, and awaited the appearance of something, though they knew not what. When the top of the great cylinder was fully 12 feet above the deck of the craft, it ceased to revolve. Moment succeeded moment as the members of the little group rigidly and almost breathlessly awaited developments. And then Dirk, with an impatient shout, stepped forward toward the yawning hole and cautiously peered over the edge of it. He stood for a moment as if transfixed, and then, with an exclamation of horror, retreated swiftly to where his friends were standing. "What is it? What did you see when—" But the words died on his lips, for swarming swiftly over every side of the well, there poured an array of erect, piercing-eyed beings, who all had the characteristics of humans. They were clad in thin-fitting attire of thin and pliant metal, which, with the exception of their faces, shielded them from head to toe. On their heads they wore close-fitting helmets, apparently equipped with visors, which could be drawn down to cover their unprepossessing features. Each of them carried a tube which bore a striking resemblance to a portable electric flashlight. And swiftly they advanced in ranks of 8 toward Dirk and his companions, who, gripped with amazement, held their positions. The first line came to a halt not more than 4 feet from the little group on the deck. The other lines halted too and formed a great platoon. Then a shrill whistle sounded, and the formation parted in the middle, leaving an open path that led backward to the entrance, to the well. A moment later, the watchers saw the regal figure of a man emerge from the orifice, and after a moment's pause advance slowly in their direction with a stately stride. He was tall and muscular and blond, and his attire, golden in texture, glittered with sparkling greens. As he approached them, he raised his right hand, and inasmuch as his countenance was calm and benign, his gesture appeared to be one of goodwill. Following close behind him, there was a younger man who very apparently was of the same lineage. His expression, however, was petulant and haughty, and it contained more than a suggestion of rapidity. Rapacity? What the heck is that? No, I know what haughty means. Rapacity. Rapacious? Yeah, rapacious or rapacity. Aggressively greedy. So it contained more than a suggestion of greed and evil. Ooh. Behind him were others of the same fair type, all of them sumptuously and ornately attired. At this, Fragoni stepped forward, himself a dignified and striking figure, as the leader of these strange adventures. Came forth from the lanelet and informed as a mobile guard of warriors. The two men confronted each other, one whose power and wealth gave him a dominant position on Earth, and the other a personage from some domain that was remote in the abyss of space. Fragoni bowed and spoke a few friendly words of welcome, and the stranger, to the utter amazement of the banker and his associates, responded in an English that was rather peculiar in accent, but that they could understand without much difficulty.
From what part of the world do you come that you speak our language?
asked the astounded Frigoni.
We come from no part of this world. The empire of my ruler is infinitely far away. But language, my friend, is not a thing of accident. Life grows out of the substance of the universe, you see, and language comes out of life. The speech of mankind in your state of development varies but little throughout all space, and I have heard your English, as you call it, spoken among those who dwell in many, many worlds.
In your world? Tell us of the planet from which you come, asked Steinhold with avid curiosity. But Frigoni, simply smiling at the eagerness of Steinhold, interposed with a kindly but arresting gesture.
My name is Frigoni. I would have you partake of my hospitality and refresh yourself after your long journey. These, he added, are my friends Steinhold, Vanderpool, and Lazar.
I am Tuxicol, vassal of His Supreme Highness Malfero of Ladora. This is my son, Zidlin, he continued, indicating the young man behind him, and the others are my high captains, Anetukon, Zitza, and Huazibar. More of my officers are below, together with 10,000 armed and armored men, such as you see before you. If the last part of the statement was intended as a threat or a warning, the expression on Frigoni's face gave no indication that he was aware of it.
You carry a large crew, sir, but we will gladly make provisions for all of your men. As for yourself, your son, and your captains, if you will come with me.
He nodded in the direction of the plane which rested on the great interplanetary vessel, and started to walk slowly in the direction of it. The leader of the Skymen walked by his side, and the other men from Ladora followed close after them. Dirk, Steinhold, and Lazar brought up the rear, while the soldiers remained motionless in their serried array. Innumerable planes were circling overhead, and hundreds of them had landed on the water in the vicinity. Dirk saw that the wanderers from the stars regarded them curiously, as if they had never before seen aircraft of that particular type. When the cabin door of the plane was thrown open, Tuxicol turned to one of his captains. Remain here, Atenukan, with the soldiers, and await our return. Tuxicol then entered the plane with his men, and Frigoni, Steinhold, and Lazar followed after them. Then Dirk took his seat at his controls.
These are strange craft you use. I have seen them in only one of the multitude of other worlds on which I set my foot, worlds which all pay tribute to Malfero of Lador. It's safer and swifter to ride the magnetic currents than it is to ride the unstable currents of the air, you know.
Dirk caught the significance of this reference to tribute, and he admired the clever diplomacy of Tuxicol, while at the same time wondering if the earth and all those who dwelled upon it were doomed to fall under the sway of some remote and unseen despot. He also realized that the Ladorians had, in some way, devised a craft that rode the great magnetic streams which flowed through the universe in much the same way that men in ships navigated the streams of the earth. He threw on the helicopter switch, and the plane rose swiftly into the air, the myriad other flying craft which were circling nearby, keeping at a safe distance from it.
Land on the Grand Terrace,
Frigoni directed. The flight was short and rapid, and it was only a matter of seconds before Dirk brought the plane down on the landing stage, which they had left only a scant half-hour before. He opened the cabin door and stepped out of the plane, and the others filed out after him. Frigoni led the way along the stage, walking and chatting with Tuxicol, and Dirk following after the others, was the last to turn a corner that brought him a sweeping view of the magnificent terrace that fronted the private apartments of the banker and his daughter. And when he did, he saw that Inga was standing there, superbly beautiful, with Stanton a few paces behind her. Her lovely eyes were alive with awe and wonder, and her slender white hands were crossed over her heart. And Dirk saw too that Zidlin, son of Texicol, had paused and was standing quite still, with his unwavering and insolent eyes fixed on the girl. Resentment and a touch of apprehension agitated Dirk when he saw the expression on the face of that young Lodorian. There was admiration in that disagreeable countenance, but it was blended with arrogance, haughtiness, and ill-concealed desire. Dirk went quickly to Inga, standing between the girl and the one from Lodore, who was staring at her so brazenly. "What does it all mean, Dirk? These strange people, where are they from?" Stanton had come quickly forward and joined Inga and Dirk. "They're from some far-off world, Inga. We know nothing about it as of yet." "But what do they want? What do they intend to do? I saw those horrible creatures through the magnoscope when they came swarming out of the inside of that thing on the water. I thought at first they were going to kill you all." No, they seem to come in peace. Tuxicol, their leader, seems to be gracious and kindly."
We're all doomed unless something happens. They can crumble our cities with heat and bury us under the ruins of them.
"Keep your silence. We'll find a way to destroy the creatures if that becomes necessary." "That man who keeps staring at me, who is he?" Dirk turned and saw that Zidlin was still standing where he had paused, and that he was still looking with searching eyes in the direction of the girl. He returned the insolent gaze of the young Lodorian with an impatient and threatening stare, and the countenance of Zidlin at once became stern and menacing. He came striding in the direction of Inga, Dirk, and Stanton, and paused within a few feet of them, his rapacious eyes still fixed on the girl. Sorry, I'm cleaning my glasses.
My lady, your beauty pleases me. I have walked on many worlds, but never before have I seen one as lovely as yourself. Of the spoils of this world, all that I crave possession of is you. When we return to Lodore, I will take you with me and place you with my other women in the Seraglio of the Stars," he said with an air of finality.
Dirk swiftly stepped close to Zidlin, and the latter quickly clasped a tube that hung at his side, a tube of the sort that the soldiers had carried.
"Your words and manner are insolent, and I warn you now to cease making yourself offensive. You dog,"
said Zidlin fiercely, leveling the metal tube.
"I'll—"
But the left fist of Dirk cut short his threat as it made a sudden impact with his chin, and the Lodorian went crashing backwards into an exotic shrubbery, with a look of surprise on his countenance. Then Dirk heard an odd hissing and crackling sound, and he felt himself becoming dizzy and weak. Darkness seemed to sweep in upon him. He felt that he was dropping swiftly through space, and then he lost consciousness. A vague and shadowy figure was standing close by his side and peering down into his face. After a while, he realized it was Steinold. "Steinold? Why am I here in Fragoni's? I must have had a dream, and yet..." He furrowed his brow in thought, and gradually commenced to remember what exactly had just happened. "It was no dream. Do you remember the trouble you had with Zidlin?" "Yes, I remember that he was insolent to Inga, and I lost my temper and struck him. But what happened to me? I don't recall that anybody hit me. I did hear a peculiar sound just before I passed out, but..." "Texicol took a shot at you, and you've been unconscious for over 36 hours.
"Took a shot at me? What did he shoot me with?"
"That's what we all would like to know. He leveled one of those tubes at you and pressed a button on it. There was a hissing sound, a flash of light, and you got groggy and went out. He potted Zitlin, too. And he apologized for the trouble that his son was responsible for. You know, I sort of like the old man. Lazar, with a sympathetic smile on his face, entered the room at that moment and overheard the conversation. Old man is right. Tuxicol admits that he is at least 3,000 years old. And then he has two. Wait, Lazar is the one with the music voice, right? Yes. Old man is right. Tuxicol admits that he's at least 3,000 years old. And that he has at least 2,000 more ahead of him. That Lador must be a very strange world. It's not so strange when you take everything into consideration. It seems quite natural when Tuxicol explains it. Lador is, well, it seems, that is to say, something like 100,000 times as big as this miniature world that we happen to live on. It took Lador infinitely longer to solidify from a gaseous state than it took this world, and its entire evolution has been relatively slower than ours. Therefore, according to Tuxicol, the people up there live longer, and incidentally, know infinitely more than we do. What time is it now? Asked Dirk after a moment of thought. It's just about 12 o'clock at night, actually. Have these Ladorians made any demands yet? Does anybody know what they're going to do, or what they want? Well, they're liable to do almost anything, and it looks as though they'll be able to get anything they want, for that matter. Tuxicol, as I understand it, just gave you a slight shock with his death ray device. If you'd pulled the trigger all the way, you'd have been just a little pile of dust that the first breeze would have blown away. Well, our death rays are somewhat similar, but they're not 100th as powerful, and they won't work on the Ladorians either. Those metal sheaths they wear are making them immune to all kinds of destructive rays. It appears as if this little world of ours is going to be taken for a ride. And it's too bad, considering it's the only world we've got. There was no formal presentation of demands yet, but it seems to be sort of understood the Earth is going to become a tributary of Lodor. It's a good thing that Tuxicol and not Zitlin is the boss of the outfit. I don't like the looks of that young fellow. He's only 1,200 years old and rather hot-blooded, I guess.
I was talking with Atenocon, and he told me that the Ladorians usually make heavy levies on worlds which they discover and dominate. As soon as Tuxicol returns to Lador and announces a new discovery, a fleet of those monsters is sent out to mop up the new planet. That Malfero, who is the Emperor of Lador, is considerable of a monarch, and it seems he has a passion for piling up wealth. Gold and platinum are as precious on Lodor as they are here, and he really enjoys pretty stones as well. And what's worse is his practice of enslaving entire populations and making toilers or warriors out of them. Those soldiers on the ship are not Lodorians. Millions of them were seized on some planet and converted into troops. It was a strange conversion, too. Their brains were operated on, and most of their faculties were removed. They have no sense of fear, no conscience, no reasoning. They respond only to certain signals on a whistle, and their only definite and active impulse is that of murder and destruction. Well, there's nothing to do but kill the interlopers if we hope to save our world, then. The three men looked at each other in silence for a moment, and then Dirk, somewhat weakly, rose into a sitting position on the bed, which he had been occupying. How can we kill them? We might, of course, get rid of a few of them. That would simply lead to our destruction by those who were left.
Well, there must be some way, and it's up to us to think of it. If we let those Ladorians get a foothold on the world, all will be lost. The old man seems to be reasonable enough. He doesn't seem inclined to be destructive. We can't trust any of them, especially not him or any of the others. We must rid the Earth of every one of them, and the sooner we strike is the better.
It had best to be soon if it is to be at all. Fraconi has arranged to have Texicol appear before the Congress, and the meeting has been called for tonight when I imagine certain specific demands will be made upon us. We will all go to the Hague together on the ship of the Ladorians.
And we leave?
The meeting is set for 10 p.m. New York time. We'll start east at about 4 o'clock in the morning, I guess, because it'll only take a minute or so to arrive at our destination.
Is Fragoni going?
Naturally. And Inga? I believe so. Fragoni was both afraid to take her and afraid to leave her behind, but finally decided we wanted her with him in case of the trouble.
And the Lodorians, are they still here?
Yes, Tuxicol returned to his ship last night with Zitlin and his other followers, but they came back late this afternoon and they're still here. Zitlin seemed to be alright this afternoon, too. They must have used some means of bringing him out of the daze he was in. We did everything we could to revive you, but none of our measures were effective.
I'm alright now. I want to see Fragoni at once, asserted Dirk as he finished attiring himself.
We'll go out of the terrace then. They're all out there.
Dirk, with his two companions, strolled out through the maze of rooms and corridors that led to the garden which hung so high above the city and the sound below it. The first thing that Dirk saw when he passed out into the terrace was the white tunic of Inga, who was leaning against a coping and talking with Zitlin. The latter was pointing skyward, and very apparently he was telling her of worlds which circled high among the stars. As if she was suddenly aware of his presence, Inga turned and saw Dirk, and he realized, by the expression on her face, that she was distraught and nervous. She came forward quickly after a few words to Zitlin, and the face of the latter darkened. There was hatred in his expression as he stared malevolently at Dirk. Steinhold and Lazar passed along and joined Fragoni and Tuxicol, who were in the center of a group that had formed in another part of the terrace.
Oh, Dirk, I'm so afraid of that frightful Zitlin. He's been telling me again he's going to take me back to his own world with him, and it makes me shudder to think of it. He's so strange, and his eyes are so terrible. He can't be as young as he looks, because if he speaks of years like we speak of minutes. I'll die if I ever find myself in that monster's power. He's been telling me all the creatures he's slain on the worlds which he's landed. And I tell you, Dirk, he's cruel and ruthless and horrible. He'll never have you, and if I hear of any more of this insolence, I'll throw him headlong from this terrace. Please, please, Dirk, don't do anything, not yet. He's utterly unscrupulous, Dirk. He told me that even now he's plotting against some Malfero who rules Lodor like a god. He's plotting against some Malfero who rules Lodor like a god. He's planning to seize the throne of the planet. He wants to make me the queen of the fearful world when he becomes king. He boasted that if I were on the throne, millions of people from other worlds would be sacrificed in my honor in temples of Lodor. Her voice trembled, and her eyes were terror-stricken as she continued. They tear out the hearts of the living victim and burn them on their high and mammoth pyramids. Rage took possession of Dirk once more, and casting a glance at Zitlin, he saw the Lodorian was smiling insolently at him. I'll kill that beast if it's the last thing I do. Dirk, don't even look at him. He's proud and impetuous, and he'll kill you in defiance of his own father. We'll have to find some way to rid the world of the scourge that is dependent upon it. And then he will die with the rest of that monster's crew. I'm going in, Dirk. Please, don't do anything rash. If something should happen, I would lose all the hope I have, and I would think, well, don't lose hope, my dear. I believe that I know of a way to destroy the plague that menaces us. He pressed her hand, and after she left him, walked over and joined the other men in the entrance. Zitlin, coming from the terrace wall, stretched out in a chair with Did on the back.
Tuxicol regarded the latter with a countenance that was calm and amicable. I'm sorry, my young friend, that I had to intervene between you and my son. He paused a moment and sat in silence, a thoughtful expression on his face. Ah, what disasters have arisen out of the desire of men for women. In my wanderings over the starlit worlds, I've seen... He ceased speaking, brooded for a moment, and then shook his head slowly. But you cannot say I was not just, he continued, addressing Dirk. I punished Zitlin for his presumption. Frigoni tells me that the woman has pledged herself to you. Let her pledge be kept, he exclaimed sternly, looking straight at Zitlin. We are the conquerors, and to us should belong the spoils of our daring, asserted the latter boldly. Silence! My own son, above all others, should be obedient to my commands, or like others have done, he shall die because of his insubordination. Zitlin, a defiant expression on his face, ceased to speak, but Dirk could see that he was livid with suppressed rage. As I was saying, Tuxicol remarked, returning to Frigoni, I'm getting old, and long have I been weary of conquest. I have seen your world, and it pleases me. It's a tiny and wonderful place. Far removed from the strife and turbulence of the restless centers of the universe. So it's my will to leave you unscathed and return to Lador for a brief time to ask the mighty Malfero the grant of this little provincial land. And then with his permission I will return here with return to benevolence. And then with his permission I will return here and rule it with wisdom and benevolence. I'll bring you much knowledge, and this peace will be brought to the people of this earth, and peace will call to me.
As well, the world, I'm certain, could hope for a wiser and more just ruler than yourself, and our Congress will surely receive you with acclaim.
Texacal bowed in recognition of the compliment, and his countenance indicated that he was gratified. We will now go back to our vessel. We will return for you at the appointed hour and conduct you to our ship, he added, speaking to Frigoni.
We'll be ready,
Frigoni replied. Alright, folks, it's been about an hour. I'm gonna be right back and make some tea, maybe get some stretching in. I would suggest you all do something similar. Get some stretching in, maybe do a little bit of yoga, shake your hands out. However, you need to get some blood moving. It's not the best for you to sit still for almost an hour at a time, or any more than an hour at a time. I mean, as you can see, I was getting a little dozy there. But we're almost done with this story, I think, so not too far left, but I'm going to be right back, and I'll return with some tea, and hopefully a little more energized. Zitlin had arisen with the rest of them, and Dirk, with a look of contempt and amusement in his eyes, regarded him casually.
May I have the honor of conducting our guests back to their ship in a plane?
Stanton requested of Frigoni. The latter nodded, and Stanton walked across the terrace in the direction of the landing stage. Zitlin, as he followed after the others, passed close to Dirk, and, pausing for a moment, fixed his hateful eyes on him.
You dog, he whispered malignantly. Remember what I tell you. The time will come when I cast you to Carniflacti in the dark and icy caverns of the sunless Stiganda. You will die the death of a million agonies.
For a moment, Dirk felt an almost irresistible impulse to hurl himself on the Ladorian and slay him. He managed to maintain his control, however, and he only regarded with Zitlin with disdain, as the latter turned and went on his way. In another moment, the plane, containing Stanton and the Ladorian, was high up in the darkness. Dirk glanced at the great clock that gleamed atop the beacon tower at the Metropole landing field. The hour was close to 12:30 a.m. A moment of silence on the terrace followed the departure of the plane that bore the Ludorians back to their craft. For an hour the clouds had been gathering in the sky, and now a fine, cold rain commenced to fall. A peal of thunder echoed above them after a sharp flash of lightning had streaked across the black night above them. A servant appeared from the entrance to the apartment and pressed a button close to the door. Protective plates of glass noiselessly enveloped the terrace, sheltering those upon it from the inclement weather.
But as well,
Remarked Fragoni, breaking the silence.
there will be a problem like a leader, by a leader like Mexico. Our tribute will not be unbearable, and he will bestow many benefits upon us.
Surely you don't intend to surrender without a struggle. Nothing but disaster will come upon the earth if you do. I see where you're coming from. Texcall may be honest and just, but after all, he's neither immortal nor all-powerful. Something could happen to him at any moment. And there are those like Zitlin who would turn the world over to ravage and, well, just all sorts of awful things and convert it to a blazing pyre if they had their way. These vandals, they must be slain, one and all, or mark my words, our world's going to go to ruin. Dirk spoke with such a sense of conviction that his words held his listeners spellbound. Who is Texacal but the vassal of a monarch whose corsairs, very apparently, are carrying on a war of conquest in the universe? It'll be disastrous, I say, to place any dependence in the goodwill of this one Ladorian. If he or any of his men return to that far-off planet where they dwell, word will be carried there of the existence of our world. But who can say that Texacal will ever return here again? It may be the whim of his ruler to refuse his request, or any one of 1,000 other events might arise to thwart his desire to live among us. No, it'll never do to let that great engine of destruction rise into the skies again. He's right. It'll be far better to annihilate these raiders if such a thing can be accomplished. Lazar, however, was rather inclined to take sides with Fragoni.
But how can such destruction be brought about? We know nothing of the capabilities of the monster that's lying down there in the Sound. It's undoubtedly equipped with the deadliest of devices, and they will all be turned upon us if we fail in an effort to destroy the thing, and those who have come from space upon it. If there was a way to smite them suddenly, to bring death to the Ludorians and those swarming, mindless, murderous minions who act in obedience to them, I would favor doing it. But as it is, it seems like inviting disaster to even think of such an attempt, much less to try it.
It can be done, though, or at least there's a fighting chance of accomplishing it. The electroskeoton, he paused and looked questioningly at Steinhold. The top of that monster, it's open, and the Teuton furrowed his brow and considered the proposition for a moment. Yes, it might be done. Again, he silently gave the subject his thought. It's well worth trying, but we'll have to make haste. If the thing is to be done before the flight to the Hag.
So be it. We'll apply ourselves to the task at hand. I, too, would rather see these vandals destroyed like so much vermin rather than have them carry the news of the existence of this earth back to those strange worlds in the depths of space. I only regret the passing of Texacal, who could have brought us such wisdom, much wisdom. And now I'll place myself under your orders, Dirk. You're the one who suggested this plan, and you will be the one to be responsible for executing it. And if it succeeds, well, I suppose the glory will be yours then as well.
I care little for the glory, but I'll gladly accept the duty and the responsibility. These are my instructions to you. Inasmuch as Texacal and his captains will return here at about 4 o'clock in the morning to convey us back to their craft, it will be necessary to have this building emptied of its inhabitants by that time. Let all of those who would dwell here depart from it a few at a time so as to not excite suspicion. Inga, above all others, must leave and retreat to a place of safety. Then, as the hour approaches for the arrival of the little Dorians, we will escape by plane from one of the rear terraces. They will land in search of us, and well, then they will feel the force of our power.
Follow your orders explicitly. I wonder where Stanton is. He should be advised of what we're going to attempt.
He'll return in due time, and if not, it'll be the worse for him. Lazar will remain here with you, and Steinholt and I will now go about our part of the task at hand. Dirk, followed by Steinholt, hurried across the terrace and, leaving the shelter of its quartzite plates, sought the landing stage. The rain was still falling, and the heavens were congested with dark and heavy clouds. Dirk, selecting one of the smaller planes, entered the cabin, and Steinholt, following after him, closed the door and threw on the lights. Swiftly they shot straight up into the air, Dirk ignoring all the rules of flight in his haste to be under way. Once in the westbound lane, he headed his plane toward Manhattan and threw the rheostat wide open. In a few minutes they were skimming over the great city and past the 3,000-foot steel tower of the worldwide broadcasting station. For 15 minutes more, he kept the plane on a straight course, and then, bringing it to a quick stop, he let it drop like a plummet toward the earth. It landed, among many other planes, on the transparent quartzite roof of a vast building, and looking down into the interior, they could see several rows of great dynamos. Some were turning, and the humming that they made could be heard plainly. Dirk and Steinholt ran rapidly across the roof until they came to a superstructure, which they entered. There was a shaft inside. Dirk pressed a button and an elevator shot up and stopped at the door, which automatically flashed open. He closed it after he and his companion had entered the cage, and after dropping rapidly downward, they came to a stop in a lighted chamber that was far below the surface of the ground. A stoop-shouldered old man greeted them, an expression of surprise on his face.
Gentlemen, what is...
"Power, Gable," commanded Sternhold tersely. "Power! Let every dynamo run its swiftness. Tonight we have to use it for the electroskyton."
But I thought it was peace those from the stars desired. Through my radio visor I heard...
"That was sent out to relieve the fears of the people and keep them in order." Swiftly the distorted figure of the old man sped to a great switchboard, where they pressed button after button. The very ground commenced to vibrate around them, and the massive structure seemed to be alive with straining power. And then Steinholt, going to a corner of the intricate board, adjusted a few levers, while his gnome-like companion watched him carefully. And now, Gable, these are your orders. At precisely the hour of 4 o'clock in the morning, make one connection with this switch." He indicated with a stubby finger the lever to be operated. "Keep the circuit closed for just 4 seconds, and then break it. Do you understand, Gable?"
"I do."
"Then, after you break that connection, you'll quickly close this next circuit. Keep it closed for 4 seconds, and then after opening it for 1 second, close it again for 4 more seconds. Repeat that procedure twice more, Gable, after that, and then await my further instructions. Is everything clear?"
"It is, sir. I will follow your orders implicitly."
"There's one thing more. Get the worldwide tower on the televisor and warn them of what is about to happen."
"I'll do that immediately."
Dirk and Steinholt shot up to the roof again, and the building over which they walked seemed to be quivering with life. They could see that all of the mammoth dynamos beneath them were now revolving and humming, and the humming which they had heard before had changed into an ugly, vibrant roar. Again they took flight, and reaching Manhattan, they continued north and east to the shore of Long Island Sound. Long before the old East River had been filled in, and the space which it had occupied reclaimed for building purposes, all indications of its former bed had been obliterated by mammoth terraced structures. When they reached their destination on the shore of the Sound was a small submarine, which Dirk had ordered by radio, and it was awaiting them. "Submerge and proceed up the Sound. Take us directly into the craft of the Ludorians, Dirk ordered the officer. In a few minutes they were skimming over the surface of the water, and when a sufficient death, yes, they're just sufficiently dead. They gotta be ghostly enough. No. In a few minutes they were skimming over the surface of the water, and when a sufficient depth had been gained, the tiny boat disappeared into the dark rippled sea. Dirk sat at a port and watched the aquatic life as it was illuminated by the powerful aquamarine searchlights. Progress under the water was comparatively slow, as mankind had made but little progress in underwater navigation. Airliners long before it almost superseded travel by land and sea, and the abolition of warfare had swept all the old navies from the ocean. It was more than an hour before the officer in charge of the boat announced that the mammoth hull of the monster that was lying on the Sound was visible directly above them. Both Dirk and Steinholt donned diving apparatus, and the former carefully adjusted the mechanism that was contained in a metallic box about 2 feet square. Then they stepped up into a chamber in the conning tower of the boat, and after a door slipped shut beneath them, water slowly commenced to pour into the compartment. When it was full, a sliding door that was in front of them slowly opened, and they passed out onto the deck of the underwater craft. Steinholt had been provided with some welding apparatus, and in a few minutes the box which Dirk had carried was attached securely to the bottom of the craft of the Ludorians. They then re-entered the submarine by reversing the process which had intended their exit, and very soon they were in the cabin of the boat again. If everything goes well, those Ludorians will never know what hit them. I only hope that we don't destroy the Leviathan altogether. We might solve the secret of it, and then we too could ride out into the heart of the universe. It's impossible to imagine what will happen until after we launch our attack. Both of the men were silent during the return trip of the small undersea craft, which emerged at its dock a little before 3:30 in the morning. We need to hurry. We need a little time to make preparations after we get back to Fragoni's. They entered their plane, and Dirk shot it swiftly up into the night, following the red shaft of light that rose almost directly from the point at which they had made their landing. Then, having reached the eastbound level, he headed straight in the direction of the palace of Fragoni. Dirk cast a glance at the great city that lay far beneath him. High up into the heavens it tossed the fulgurant fires that betokened its wealth and power. Fulgurant, that sounds like having to do with electricity or lightning. Fulgurant. Fulguration in medicine. The destruction of small growths or areas of tissue using diathermy. That doesn't seem like the definition we need. Let's look at the full definition, shall we? Poetic literature. A flash like that of lightning. What did I say? I was right. And down among those myriad lights, millions and millions of people were restless under the danger that menaced them. It was only a matter of moments now before their fate, and the fate of their great metropolis as well, would be decided. By dawn they would be free forever from the threat of subjugation and slavery, or else they, and all that they had toiled and striven for, would be the veriest dust of dying embers. And whatever befell them likewise would befall the rest of the world, and every living thing that moved upon it. Dirk was high above Fragoni's when he stopped the forward flight of the plane, and dropping it rapidly through the misty night, brought up easily on the landing stage. The other planes which had been there when he and Steinholt had taken their departure were gone, and Dirk felt a sense of relief when he observed this. Inga then must have departed with the other occupants of the colossal structure. Things were going according to the plan that he had conceived. He stepped out of the cabin, followed by Steinholt, and proceeded hastily along the terrace, and turned the corner into the garden. And then he came to an abrupt halt, because there, before him, was Zitlin, with one of the deadly ray tubes of the Ludorians in his hand. Cue dramatic piano chord, am I right? Dirk knew immediately that something unexpected had happened, and that he was in the power of one who not only hated him, but also had an unholy desire for Inga. He realized, too, that any show of resistance would be nothing short of suicide, for he was well aware of the deadliness of the strange weapon with which he and Steinholt were being menaced by the gloating Ledorian.
One false move and you die. Come forward now and join those two others over whom and two Connons who ones about are watching.
Dirk and Steinholt promptly obeyed the command of the Zitlin and walked over to where Fragoni and Lazar were being guarded by two of the conquerors. The rain had ceased to fall, but the skies were dark and overcast with heavy clouds. There was an occasional flash of lightning, and thunder rolled and echoed through the night. The terrace, however, was brightly illuminated, and every detail of the scene around him was visible to Dirk. He saw Stanton, on another part of the terrace, standing among some Ledorians as he had not seen before. Stanton apparently was not being treated as a prisoner, and Dirk wondered rather vaguely why this was. What happened?
According to what I've heard, Zitlin murdered his father in a fit of rage and has taken over the command of the ship. Many of the Ledorians are his adherents, and even those who do not favor are so terrified that they will be obedient to his wishes.
Excuse me, I'm pouring water. Just a moment. You gotta stay hydrated. It's good for you. And Inga?
She's inside the apartment. Zitlin surprised us completely, and he and his men had us covered before we realized Toxicol was not among them.
Zitlin, in the meantime, had entered the suite of Fragoni, and now he came out, Inga walking before him. She was silent and proudly erect, but there was the pallor in her face that indicated a realization of the danger with which she was being threatened. When Dirk saw her, she gave him a brave smile, which he answered with a glance of reassurance. He could see the great clock in the Metropole Tower, and he noticed with a feeling of grave apprehension that it was 20 minutes to 4 o'clock. There were only a few minutes more in which to make a desperate and apparently hopeless effort to save Inga, his friends, and himself from a catastrophe which he had been instrumental in contriving. Then Zitlin stood before him, haughty and arrogant, his lowering countenance ugly with hatred.
So, dog, you who dared to defy Zitlin, now stand before him a captive.
Neither Dirk nor any one of the three others who guarded with him replied to the utterance.
You and that woman of yours both are my prisoners, to do with as I please. Your fate I already planned for you, and I assure you it will not be as pleasurable as the one she is destined. You'll find that Tigana, on which you and those with you will be cast, is a world of terror such as you never could dream of. Even the monsters which crawl through the deliriums of the mind are not as horrible as those which infest the mad and haunted world of which I speak.
He paused a moment, a cruel smile on his face, as if he wished the full import of his words to sear themselves into the minds of the doomed men.
But the women will return to Ledor with me and be the queen of all women, and soon she may be queen of all Ledor, all of the worlds which pay tribute to Ledor, and of other worlds which I conquer and ravage. My father stood in my way, and he died at my own hands. So will others perish who thwart my ambition. I'll become supreme in the universe.
A feeling of reckless fury possessed Dirk as he listened to the words of Zitlin, and he felt an almost irresistible desire to drive a fist square between the mad, glittering eyes of the Ledorian. He glanced at the great clock, however, and saw that the time to act had not yet come. At the last moment he would make one desperate attempt to frustrate the evil designs of Zitlin. If it failed, well, all would be lost. But it was a far better thing to die resisting the despicable Zitlin and his minions than it would be to live and to know that without a struggle he had abandoned to degradation the girl he loved.
This world of yours will be mine, and the spoils from it will add to my riches. This one here, he continued, indicating Stanton, has offered to show me where all the treasures of the earth may be found. As a reward, he will return to the door with me and there be elevated to a high position.
That, then, was why Stanton was not under guard like the rest of them.
Our good friend Stanton seems to have become something of a Judas.
And let his name be forever cursed like the name of Judas.
Silence! I, Zitlan, are speaking. When I garner up the treasures of this world in the way of precious stones and metals, I shall also gather more priceless loot in the way of women. And then, having taken all that I desire, I will lay waste to this earth, so that those who will survive will fear the name of Zitlan and will grovel before him like a god when once again he appears to them.
While Zitlan had been speaking, Dirk had been studying the opponents with whom he soon had to clash. The two Lodorians, who were standing guard over himself and his companions, were close to his left side. Zitlan was directly in front of him, and there were 7 of his minions clustered behind him. Again, Dirk glanced at the great dial of the clock, and he saw that it was 7 minutes before 4. The moment had come to act if action was to prove of any avail.
I will...
But the words of Zitlan were interrupted by Dirk, who suddenly made a mighty sweep with his left arm, and knocked the deadly tubes from the hands of Atenakon and Huazabar. Startled by the assault, they went reeling backward, and at almost the same instant, Dirk leapt forward and, seizing Zitlan, hurled him among the Lodorians who had been massed behind him. Then he threw himself violently into the tangled mass, his fist diving in and out with deadly strength. Out of the corner of one eye, he saw Inga pass the melee and dart swiftly to the corner of the terrace. Instead of passing around to the landing stage, however, she lingered there and watched the combat. Dirk, as he fought, became conscious that Steinholt and Frigoni were at his side, battling with him against his enemy. He saw, too, that Stanton had retired to the far end of the terrace and was watching the struggle with frightened eyes. "We must reach the plane and get away in another 3 minutes," he felt a Lodorian who, having lost his tube, was about to grapple with him, and he saw Steinholt send another one of their opponents reeling backward.
"Frigoni, the plane, get in, with Inga. We'll come."
Even as he spoke, his fists were flailing back and forth between each one of his staccato commands. He saw beneath him a hand reaching toward a tube, and he kicked the instrument of death. It hurtled over in the direction of Stanton and landed close to his feet. Stanton might have picked it up and been in possession of the means of aiding his old friends or his new allies. But instead he shrunk away, panic-stricken, from the thing that lay so close to his reach. A Lodorian leaped upon Dirk's back in an effort to bring him to the ground, but he stooped swiftly forward, and his assailant was catapulted over his head into those who were in front of him. He caught a flash of the contorted face of Zitlan flying through the air, and saw him land with a crash on the terrace, and lie there writhing in pain. "Steinholt, Lazar, we've got to strike once more, and then run!" He plunged into their enemies with every bit of energy that he had left, and saw 2 of them toppling down. Then, like a flash, he turned to Lazar, who was trying to fight off 3 of the Lodorians. Seizing one of them by the waist, Dirk hurled him backward, and he disposed of another one in the same manner. His sheer desperation seemed to have given him unbounded strength and power. Lazar sent his 3rd opponent down with a blow under the chin, and then, with Dirk at his side, they turned to the assistance of Steinholt. With one mad rush, they crashed into a group of Lodorians and sent them reeling away like so many 9-pins. "Now to the plane!" exclaimed Dirk, taking to his heels across the terrace. Steinholt and Lazar followed after him, and turning the corner, they saw that the ship was already in place, and that Frigoni was anxiously waiting by the door of the cabin. Inga, Dirk knew, was already inside and safe. He stood aside while Steinholt and Lazar leapt in. During the momentary wait, he caught a glimpse of the great clock. It was 1 minute to 4. Dirk jumped into the plane and switched on the helicopter, without even waiting to close the cabin door. The ship shot skyward like a rocket once more, and when it reached an altitude of 3,500 feet, he turned it north and raced at top speed in that direction. It was miles away from the palace of Fragoni in less than 30 seconds. Dirk then stopped the plane and held it poised in the air with the helicopter. The skies were turgid and black, and the massed clouds, reflecting the lights of the great city below them, were permeated with an ugly, feverish red glow. From where they were hanging in midair, the occupants of the plane could plainly see the sparkling palace of Fragoni towering high up into the darkness of the night. The lights of the magnificent mansion were reflected far out into the sound, where, looming in the golden ripples, lay the sinister monster from the terrible depths of unfathomable space. Dirk took a watch from his pocket, and after glancing at it, hastily replaced it. 2 seconds more, and a sharp and dazzling bolt of greenish fire came hurling suddenly out of the west, and with a thunderous concussion seemed to fasten itself on the crest of Fragoni's palace. It trembled and quivered, as if endowed with some uncanny life and power, and it remained there against the darkness, throwing a weird green tinge over the water and up into the skies. Blue waves of light could be seen pulsing and racing along the terrible beam, and there where it had fastened itself, they seemed to disappear in the vast and crumbling structure. For 4 seconds in that destructive streak of light, one end of which was lost back in the mist that concealed Manhattan, tore the proud pile. And as the stone crumbled and steelite fused under the mighty assault, an ominous roar swept through the night. The air was so violently agitated that the plane, miles away, tossed up and down like a tiny boat on a stormy sea. Then just as suddenly, the bolt was gone, but its livid image still burned in the eyes of those who had been watching it. Once more it came hurtling out of the west, and like the fang of some great and deadly serpent, darted into the monster that lay in the waters of the Sound. Dirk and his companions could see plainly, by the light of the bolt itself, that it had crashed into the well from which the Lodorians had first appeared, and that it was beating and hammering its way into the very vitals of the craft. Dazzling, blinding fire seemed to pour from the aperture through which the bolt had passed. The clamor that rose was deafening. Then again the streak of fires was withdrawn, leaving the night intensely black until, in a moment more, it came thundering out of the west again, and with an impact that made the land and the sea and the very heavens tremble, hurled its way into the depths of the doomed Leviathan. Twice again it fell, a fiery scimitar out of darkness, and twice again it careened at the vitals of the stricken monster. Then after the assault was over, the ship still floated on the surface of the Sound, and the shell, well, as far as Dirk and the others could judge, was still unscathed.
We'll soon know our fate. If that didn't kill those beasts, we might as well just give up our ghosts.
I'll drop the plane a little lower and a little nearer to the ship. I don't believe that any life could be surviving in that thing.
My beautiful palace, it's nothing but dust. And all my beautiful treasures.
And that beautiful Zidlin, and the beautiful friends, they're all dust too, thank Hydia. It was a strange fate that Stanton met. He thought he could save his life by going over to the enemies, but ironically that's what lost him it.
Poor Stanton. He was born that way, I suppose. I, for one, am ready to forgive and forget. And now I hope we didn't do too much damage to the little boat of the Lodorians. If we could just get a little peep at the inside of it, we might learn the secret of its contrivance. And then, my friends, we could do a little journeying ourselves. Have you any theory regarding it? Tuxicol intimated that it rode through the magnetic currents, which of course flew through all the suns and planets in the universe. We've been working along that line ourselves, of course, and it probably wouldn't be very long anyway before we'd have that solution of interplanetary travel.
Those Lodorians would have solved it for us if it hadn't been for that artificial lightning. That's powerful stuff, Steinholt.
Yes, with that 3,000-foot worldwide tower to hurl it with, we can get fair range. If the Lodorians hadn't left the well of their ship open, though, I don't think the lightning would have done us much good. I was afraid, too, for a time, that we might have trouble in welding that automatic wireless circuit to the
box to the bottom of the ship. Dirk, in the meantime, had brought the plane down within a half-mile of the Leviathan, and he was holding it poised there. "It seems to me," he said, after scrutinizing the monster for a couple minutes, "that it's moving in the water. It is! Steinhold, look!" Only a comparatively short time had elapsed since the last bolt of lightning had vanished back into the darkness. "It's still rocking with the force of the shock we gave it. You'd be rocking too if you'd been tickled by a bolt like that one. It's rising! The front end of it's getting slowly higher in the water."
"You're right, Dirk. Look, it just rocked back into the water."
Then, as they watched, the movements of the Leviathan became more and more agitated, until it was churning the waves around it, like a wounded and agonized monster of the sea. Suddenly, the front end tilted upward, and the monster rose clear of the water. It shot straight up into the air at a speed so terrific they could scarcely follow it.
"It's God, this brainless, mindless automaton must have survived."
"No, I don't believe that there's any life left on that thing. No one could have closed the well when it rose, and it'd mean death to go out into space with a ship in that condition."
Then what made it go up? Can the thing run itself, Steinhold?
"I imagine that our bolts killed every living thing that was on the craft, but that at the same time they set the mechanism of the monster into motion. Oh, but that's too bad. We could have learned so much by an examination of the interior of that liner of the air." A cry from Inga startled them, and they saw that she was looking skyward with terror in her eyes. They followed her gaze, and there, streaking through the black clouds, they saw a long trail of white fire.
"It's that thing. I tell you, those upon it still live, and they're about to wreak their vengeance upon us."
"No, you're wrong, Fragoni. What's happening maybe is almost as disastrous, though. That Leviathan is in its death agonies. It's a metal monster gone mad, and none of us can say what'll happen before it expires." "The place for us is in the Worldwide Tower. We can keep track of what's transpiring and figure out what to do." The others agreed with him, and seeking the westward level of flight, he sped the plane in the direction of the Mammoth Pyramid, from which the news of the world was broadcast. They reached the vast structure in a few minutes, and after dropping the plane on the landing stage, they went into the operating room. Here they learned that the craft of the Ludorians was doing incalculable damage. It was throwing the population of the world into an unprecedented panic. It was apparently following an erratic, uncertain orbit that took it far out into space and then quite back close to the surface of the Earth again. It passed through the very heart of Chicago within a few yards of the ground, and had cut and burned a swath more than a mile wide through the buildings of that metropolis. Other cities in America had felt the devastating effects of its irresistible and molten heat, and within a short time thousands of people had been slain by it. Time and time again, from the terrace of the great tower, Dirk and his companions saw the skies above them light up as that terrible blazing projectile which, uncontrolled, went hurtling on its way through the night. For 3 hours it careened on its mad course, and hysteria reigned throughout the cities of the whole civilized world. But a report came from a rocket liner that had left Berlin en route for San Francisco. Either a great meteor or the Leviathan of the Ludorians just swept down past us in mid-Atlantic and plunged into the sea. Apparently it's exploded, for it's thrown a great column of water from miles up into the air. We're stopping and standing by, although the heat's intense, and the clouds of steam are rising from the sea. As the minutes passed by after the report from the rocket ship had been received, the disappearance from the sky of the flaming craft from space seemed to confirm the belief that it had been swallowed by the ocean. This was accepted as a certainty by 8 o'clock in the morning. Oh, if it had only crashed on land somewhere, if only there was enough of it left for us to...
Enough of any of that contraption of any kind is altogether too much. I hope, for one, that its fragments are scattered so far we never put them together again.
Dirk and Inga leaned against one of the parapets that evening on the garden terrace of his own great mansion in Manhattan. That little party had gone there after leaving the Worldwide Tower in the morning. After resting during the day, Lazara and Fragoni were somewhere together, discussing the plans for a new palace to take the place of the one that was destroyed so that Zitlin and its minions might die in its ruins. Steinholt elsewhere was delving into oceanography and submarine engineering in an attempt to learn whether or not it would be feasible to fish for the remains of the lost ship of Ledora.
It seems like a dream, doesn't it, Dirk? It's difficult to believe we've actually seen and talked with people from some faraway world.
Together they looked up into the crystalline skies, where mazes of shining stars gave testimony to the countless worlds which were wheeling around them.
And to think, Dirk, it was you who saved this world and all its people from that horrible Zitlin and its horde.
I saved you, and that means more to me than saving all this world and all the other worlds which are rolling through the uncharted ways of time and space. Alright, folks. I'm just going to go through this, because the last one I had a bunch of vintage ads in the back, so I'm going to make sure that those aren't here in this one. Nope, just the Gutenberg license. So actually, I was going to say we were just going to be done with paper cuts after this issue was done, but we're only an hour and a half in. I'm going to take another really quick intermission while I set up the next book and use the restroom and a couple of other assorted things. This one will be much shorter than the tea break, I promise. But I will be right back, and we'll come back with the we'll come back with the April 1930 issue of Astounding Stories of Super Science, along with a little backstory about Astounding Stories of Super Science itself. So see you all in a moment. Before we dive into the next story, which is The Man Who Was Dead by Thomas H. Knight, I want to talk about what we're reading, because I learned about it the other day. Because, I'm just that sort of person who just goes on Wikipedia dive sometimes. And I learned a lot about this particular publication. I was just curious, so I Googled it. And the Wikipedia told me quite a few interesting things. So this was a really popular science fiction pulp for a good long while. About as long as as science fiction pulps were popular, actually. And it started out, as we know it, as Astounding Stories of Super Science. And it was run by one guy, right? I don't remember his name. But he's very fond of the just standard, really pulpy science fiction stories. And then, at some point, I think around the 1960s, maybe the 1970s, there was a change in ownership and a change in name. After the 1960s or the 1970s-ish, it was called, I think, analog science fiction, something along that line. Let me open the Wikipedia page just to double check. Astounding Stories of Super Science. Show me the analog science fiction fact. There we go. That's what it was called. So, it was called, it started out as Astounding Stories, and the first issue was in the 30s. And we've gotten up to the 4th issue. And, so, there was another, around the 1950s, the original owner had started getting into some of what eventually evolved into Scientology, and a lot of the regular writers was not a fan of that. Were not a fan of that, rather. And then there was a change of ownership in the 60s, so 10 years later, and they changed the name to Analog Science Fiction Fact. And it became a lot more like seedy, just as far as I can tell it. Like, the literal line from Wikipedia was, the guy who was running it was willing to publish fiction that included sexual content and profanity. So it kind of got a little darker, a little more serious, a little more adult. However, despite that, there's a
bunch of stuff from that period of time, which was nominated for like Hugos and Nebulas, and like just other big science fiction awards. And they actually serialized a portion, if not all, of Dune at one point. So analog science fiction, in fact, like has kind of, it's been the big bad of the big guy who knows things about science fiction for a long time. And the guy after that, the guy who took over in the 60s, after the Scientology guy kind of like got kicked out, the guy who took over in the 60s went until, where the heck did this guy stop being? When did this guy stop? Yeah. Yes. So, after Bova, who was the guy who was after the original owner, Campbell, after Bova was Schmidt, who is still running it now. Oh, ran it until 2012. And he was the sort of guy who, I'm quoting Wikipedia here, knew what his readership wanted and made sure they got it, commenting in 1985, "I reserve analog for that kind of science fiction I've described here. Good stories about people with problems in which some piece of plausible, or at least not demonstratively implausible, speculative science plays an indispensable role." And that's a good category of science fiction. In my mind, there are two categories of science fiction. There's that he described there, that like, basically, check out this neat science thing that might be a thing. Also, here's an adventure to go with it. And then there's political science fiction, which, like, uses speculative science as set dressing to tell a story that would otherwise sometimes be controversial, and it kind of rose out of necessity to avoid censors and stuff in the era of the Twilight Zone. But anyway, yeah, the guy who ran it until 2012, he retired in 2012, obviously. And then this new guy, Trevor Quattree, who I don't know a lot about, his entire Wikipedia page is the fact that he is now the editor of Analog Science Fiction Fact. But this is the fun part. This is still running. Like, currently. The magazine we're reading right now, you can still buy, like, a version of this magazine for, like, at a bi-monthly price for, like, $5. No, wait, I lied. It's $5 for the issues that aren't 2 months together at the same time. And they cram January, February, and July, August together. So it's $5 for the not 2-month issues, and it's $8 for the 2-month issues now. Compared to the era we're reading, which it was 20 cents an issue. So that really tells you something. But I'm curious, 20 cents in 1930 is how much in 2018? $23 or $1930 in, let's say, 20 cents. Tell me. Yeah. It would be equivalent to paying $3 now. So, you're really only paying $2 more equivalently, which isn't bad. There's also just a bunch of anthologies of this old stuff. And it's like, I'm just shocked that this is still running. And I'm also like, once I get through with all the ones I have downloaded on my e-reader right now, I am very tempted to, like, contact these people. And, yeah, like, there's a contact button. I'm very tempted to contact these people and get, like, the January, February 2018 like, issue and say, like, hey, I'm running a show where I've been reading, like, Astounding Stories, which is basically the grandfather of your magazine. Can I read a modern issue just to see what it's evolved into? And, you know, the main issue with that is copyright. And that's why I'm contacting the people who own the magazine. So I'm working on that. I'm in talks to sort. I will be in talks very soon to sort that out. Considering that what I have left, we're on April. So let's look at how many I have left right now. We're on April. So April, May, June, July, August, September, October, November, December of 1930. That's all. So I think we're just going to go through the 1930 run. I think online they have the runs up to 1932, because those are what are in the public domain right now. But I'm just gonna run from the beginning of 1930 to the end of 1930, and I'm gonna call it good. And I'm going to, probably right after this, I'm going to email the folks over at Analog Science Fiction and say, hey, I'm doing an internet show where I've been reading the, like, ancient version of your magazine. Please let me read your new ones, thanks. And, like, one thing I know that is different is there's an opinion column called Alternate View, which, oh boy, real exciting. Yeah, and, like, reading the like, about the Explorer Analog kind of thing is, yeah, it's like, launched in 1930, Analog offers imaginative fiction reflecting the highest standards of scientific accuracy, as well as lively fact articles about the current research on the frontiers of real science. Yeah, but, like, in total, these stories, they've gotten 39 Hugo Awards and 23 Nebula Awards. And for those of you who don't know, the Hugo Award, let's look up the Hugo Award. The Hugo Awards are a set of literary awards given annually for the best science fiction or fantasy works and achievements of the previous year. It's basically like the Pulitzer, but for science fiction in particular. And the Nebula Awards are very similar. Like, if we look at Wikipedia, Nebula Awards. The Nebula Awards annually recognize the best works of science fiction or fantasy published in the United States. So it's the United States only version of the Hugo. Yeah. And, like, yeah, the Hugo Award is highly regarded by observers. The Los Angeles Times has termed it among the highest honors bestowed in science fiction and fantasy writing. It's a big deal, you know. It's really a big deal to get a Hugo Award, or a Nebula Award for that matter. So it's like they're big deals. You get that award for doing real good. So, you know. Actually, the magazine itself has received 8 Hugo Awards. Anyway, I digress a great deal. Let's get back into the story, shall we, folks? Let's return to the Astounding Stories rather than Analog Science Fiction, and let's learn about The Man Who Was Dead, written by Thomas H. Knight. It was a wicked night, the night I met the man who had died. A bitter, heart-rumbling night of weird, shrieking wind and flying snow. A few black hours I will never forget. "Well, Jerry lad,"
my mother said to me as I pushed back from the table and started for my sheepskin coat and the lantern in the corner of the room.
Surely you're not going out on a night like this. Goodness gracious, Jerry, it's not fit.
I can't help it, Mother. I gotta go. You've never seen me miss a Saturday night yet, have you?
No, but I've never seen a night like this for years either. Jerry, I'm really afraid you may freeze before you even get as far as...
Oh, come now, Mother. They'd guy me to death if I didn't sit with the gang tonight. They'd chaff me because it was too cold for me to get out. I'm no pampered sissy, you know, and I want to see...
Yes, I know. You just want to go and bask in that elegant company. Our stove's just as good as the one down at that dirty old store,
continued my persistent and anxious parent.
And it's certainly not very flattering to think you'll leave us on a night like this. Who'll be there anyway?
The usual 5 or 6, I suppose, I answered as I adjusted the wick of my lantern, hearing as I did the snarl and cut of the wind through the evergreens in the yard.
And that black-whiskered sphinx, Hammersley, will he be there?
Yes, he'll be there, I'm sure.
She
exclaimed, her expression now carrying all the contempt for my judgment and taste she intended it should.
Button up your coat good around your neck, then, if you must go see your precious Hammersley and the rest of them. You ever heard that man say anything yet? Does he speak at all, Jerry?
Then her gentle mind, not at all accustomed to hard thoughts or contemptuous remarks, quickly changed.
Funny thing about that fellow, he's got something on his mind. Don't you think so, Jerry?
Yes, I do. And I've often wondered what it would be. He certainly is a queer... This is a strange phrase that I'm really hoping it means just like a weird dude. He certainly is a queer stick. Gotta admit that. Always brooding. Good fellow, all right, and a sphinx, as you call him. Likeable. That I'm also missing just 2 whole pieces of slang that I've missed already. But I wonder what's eating him.
What do you suppose it could be, Jerry boy?
Questioned Mother, now following me to the door, the woman of her now completely forgetting her recent criticisms, and perhaps the rough night her son was about to step into.
You suppose the poor chap has a broken heart or something like that? A girl somewhere who jilted him? Or maybe he loves someone he has no right to?
She finished excitedly, the plates in her hand rattling. Maybe it's worse than that. Perhaps, and no right to say it, but perhaps, and I've often thought it, there's a killing he wants to forget and can't. I heard my mother's sharp little "oh" as I shut the door behind me, and the warmth and comfort of the room away. Outside it was worse than the whistle of the wind through the trees had led me to expect. Black as pitch it was, and cold as blazes. For the first moment or two, though, I liked the feel of a challenge, of a night, and the racing elements. Was even a little glad I added to the dare of the blackness the thought of Hammersley and his killing. But I hadn't gone far before wishing I didn't have to save my face by putting in an appearance at the store that night. Every Saturday night, with the cows comfortable in their warm barn and my own supper over, I was in the habit of taking my place on the keg, or the box, behind the red-hot stove in Pruitt's store. Tonight, all the snow was being hurled clear of the fields to block the roads but full between the old zigzag fences. The wind met me in great pushing gusts, and while it flung itself at me, I'd hang against it, snow to my knees, until the blow had gone along, when I could plunge forward again. I was glad when I saw the lights of the store, and glad when I was inside. They met me with mock applause for my pluck in facing the night, but for all their sham flattery, I was pleased I had come, proud, I must admit, that I'd been able to plow my heavy way through the drifts to reach them. I saw at a glance that my friends were all there, and I saw too that there was a strange man present. A very tall man he was, gaunt and awkward as he leaned into the angle of the 2 counters, his back to a dusty showcase. He attracted my attention at once, not merely because he appeared so long and pointed and skinny, but because of all the ridiculous things in that frozen country. He wore a hard derby hat. If he hadn't been such a strange character, it'd have been laughable, but as it was a little creepy. For the man beneath that hard hat was about as strange a looking character as I'd ever seen. I supposed he was a visitor at the store, or a friend to one of my friends, perhaps, and that in a little while I'd be introduced, but I wasn't. I took my place in behind the stove, feeling at once, though I'm far from being unsociable usually, the man was an intruder and would spoil the evening. But despite his cold, dampening presence, we were soon at it, hammer and tongs, discussing the things that are discussed behind hospitable stoves in country stores on bad nights. But I could never lose sight of the fact that the stranger standing there, silent as the grave, was, to say the least, a strange one. Before long, I was sure he was no friend or a guest of anyone there, and that he'd not only cast a pall over me, but over all of us. I didn't like it, nor did I like him. Perhaps it would have been just as well after all, I thought, had I heeded my mother and stayed home. Jed Counsell was the one who, innocently enough, started the thing that changed the evening that had already begun so badly into a nightmare. Jerry, I was thinking of you this afternoon. I was reading an article about reincarnation. Remember we were arguing about it last week? Well, this guy, whoever he was, I forgot, he believes in it. Yeah, says it's so that people do come back. With this opening shot, Jed sat back to await my answer. I like these arguments, and I like to bear my share in them. But now, instead of immediately answering the challenge, I looked around to see if any others of our circle were going to answer Jed. Then, deciding it was up to me, I shrugged off the strange feeling the man in the corner had cast over me and prepared to view my opinions. That's just the fellow's belief, Jed, and just as he's got his, so have I have mine. And on this subject, I can at least claim my opinion as good as anybody's. I was getting nicely started and a little forgetting my distaste for the man in the corner when the fellow himself interrupted. He left his leaning place and came creaking across the floor to our circle around the stove. I say he came creaking, as he came. He did creak. Shoes, I naturally, almost unconsciously decided, though the crazy notion was in my mind that the cracking I heard did indeed sound like bones and joints and sinews badly in need of oil. The stranger sat his groaning self down among us on a board lying over a nail keg and an old chair. Only from the corner of my eye did I see his movement, being friendly enough, despite my dislike, not to allow too marked notice of his attempt to be sociable, seeming inhospitable on my part. I was about to start again with my argument when Seth Spears, sitting closest to the newcomer, deliberately got up from the bench and went to the counter, telling Pruitt that he had to have some sugar. It was all a farce, a pretext, I knew. I've known Seth for years and never known him to take upon himself for buying for his wife's kitchen. Seth simply wouldn't sit beside the man. At that, I could keep my eyes from the stranger no longer, and the next moment I felt my heart turn over within me and then lie still. I've seen walking skeletons in circuses, but never such a man as the one who was sitting just then at my right hand. These sideshow men were just lean in comparison to the fellow who had invaded our Saturday night club. His thighs and legs and his knees, sticking sharply into his trousers, looked like pieces of inchboard. His shoulders and chest seemed flat and sharp as his legs. The sight of the man shocked me. I sprang to my feet, thoroughly frightened. I couldn't see much of his face sitting there in the dark as he was with his back to the light, but I could make out enough of it to know that it was in keeping with the rest of him. In a moment or two, realizing my childishness, I fought down my fear, and pretending that a scorching on my leg had caused my hurried movement, I sat down again. None of the others said a word, each waiting for me to continue and break the embarrassing silence. Hammersley, black-whiskered, the Sphinx as my mother had called him, watched me closely. Hating myself not a little bit for actually being the sissy I boasted I was not, I spoke hurriedly and loudly to cover my confusion. "No, sure, Dad. When a man's dead, he's dead. There's no bringing him back like the highbrow claimed. The old heart may be only hitting about once in every 100 times, and then when they catch it right at the last stroke, they may bring it back then. But once she's stopped, Jed, she's stopped for good. Once the pulse is gone and life is flickered out, it's out. It doesn't come back in any form at all, not in this world."
I was glad when I had said it, thereby asserting myself and downing my foolish fear of the man, whose eyes I felt burning into me. I didn't turn to look at him, but all the while I felt his gimlety eyes digging into my brain. And then he spoke. And even though he sat right next to me, his voice sounded like a moan from afar off. It was the first time that we heard this thing that once may have been a voice, that now sounded like a groan from a closely nailed coffin. He reached a hand toward my knee to enforce his words, but I jerked away.
So, you don't believe a man can come back from the grave, huh? Believe that once a man's heart is still, that stopped for good, huh? Well, you're wrong, Sonny. All wrong. You believe these things. Well, I know them.
His interference, his condescension, his whole hatefulness angered me. I could no longer control my feelings. Oh, you know, do you? On such a subject as this, you're entitled to know, huh? Don't make me laugh, I finished insultingly. I was roused, and I'm a big fellow with no reason to fear ordinary men.
Yes, I know,
came back his echoing, scratching voice. How do you know? Maybe you've been?
Yes, I have,
he answered, his voice breaking to a squeak.
Take a good look at me, gentlemen. A good look.
He knew now that he held the center of the stage, that the moment was his. Slowly, he raised an arm to remove that ridiculous hat. Again, I jumped to my feet, for as his coat sleeve slipped down his forearm, I saw nothing but bones supporting his hand. And the hat that then bared his head was a skeleton hand. Slowly the hat was lifted, but quickly as light six able-bodied men were on their feet, and halfway to the door before we realized the cowardliness of it. We forced ourselves back inside the store very slowly, all of us rather ashamed of our ridiculous and childlike fear, but it was enough to make the blood curdle with that live, dead thing sitting there by our fire. His face and skull were nothing but bone, the eyes deeply sunk into their sockets, dull brown skin like parchment in its tautness, drawn and shriveled down into the nose and jaw. There were no cheeks, just hollows. The mouth was a sharp slit beneath the flat nose. He was hideous.
Come back and I'll tell you my yarn,
he mocked. The slit was his mouth opening a little to show us the empty, blackened gums.
I've been dead once.
He went on, getting a lot of satisfaction from the weirdness of the lie and from our fear.
And I came back. Come sit down and I'll explain why I'm this living skeleton.
We came back, slowly, and as I did, I slipped my hand into my outside pocket, where I had the revolver. I put my finger on the trigger and got ready to use the vicious little thing. I was on edge and torn to pieces completely by the side of the man, and I doubt not that had he made a move toward me, my frayed nerves would have plugged him full of lead. I eyed my friends, and they were in no better way than I was. Fright and horror stood on each face. Hammersley was the worst. His hands were twitching, and his eyes were like bright glass, his face bleached and drawn.
I've got quite a yarn to tell. I've had quite a life. A full life. I've taken my fun and my pleasure wherever I could. Perhaps you'll call me selfish and greedy, but I always used to believe that a man only passed this way once, just like you'll believe.
He nodded to me, his neck muscles and jaw creaking.
6 years ago, I came up into this country and got a job on a farm.
He went on, settling into his story.
Just an ordinary job, but I liked it, because the farmer had a pretty little daughter of about 16 or 17. Easy as could be. You may not believe it, but you can still find dames green enough to fall for the right story. Well, this one did. I told her I was only out there for a time, for my health, and I was rich back in the city, with a fine home and everything.
She believed me, that little fool. He chuckled as he said it, and my anger, mounting with every devilish word, made the finger on the trigger in my pocket take a tighter crook to itself. I asked her to skip with me, made her a lot of great promises, and she fell for it. His dry jawbones clanked and clattered as if he enjoyed the beastly recital of his achievement, while we sat gaping at him, believing that either the man must be mad, or that we were the mad ones, or dreaming, or something. We slipped away one night, went to the city, to a punk hotel. 3 weeks we stayed there. Then one morning I told her I was going out for a shave. I got the shave. But I hadn't thought it worthwhile to tell her I wouldn't be back. She got back to the farm some way. I don't know how. What? I shouted, springing before him. What? You mean you left her there? After you'd taken her, you left her, and you sit here crowing over it, gloating, boasting, why you... I lived in a rough country, associated with rough men, heard their vicious language, but seldom used a strong word myself. But as I stood over that monster, utterly hating the beastly thing, all the vile oaths and prickly language of the countryside, no doubt buried in some unused cell in my brain, spilled from my tongue upon him. When I lashed him as fiercely as I was able, I cried, "Why didn't you come at me? Didn't you hear what I just called you? You beast, I'd like to riddle you!" I shouted, drawing my gun. "Oh, sit down," he jeered, waving his rattling hand at me. "You haven't heard a thing yet. Let me finish." Well, she got back to the farm some way or another. Something over a year later. I wandered into this country again, too. Could never explain just why I came back. It wasn't altogether to see the girl. Her father was a little bit of a man. I began to remember what a meek and weak sheep he was. I got it in my head it'd be fun to go back to his farm and rub it in, so there I came. Her father was trying out a new corn planter right at the back door when I rounded the house and walked towards him. Then I saw at once I made a mistake. He put his eyes on me, his face went white and hard. Came down from the sheet of that machine like a flash, took a couple hurried steps in the direction of a double-barreled gun leaning against the woodshed. They were always troubled with hawks and kept a gun handy, but there was an axe nearer to me than the gun was to him. I had to work fast, but I made it all right. Grabbed that axe and jumped at him as he reached for the gun and swung. Once. His wife and the girl, too, saw it. Then I turned and ran. The gaunt brute before us slowly crossed one groaning knee above the other. We were all sitting again now. The perspiration rolled down my face. I held my gun trained upon him, and though I now believed he was totally mad because of a certain ring of truth in that empty voice, I sat, fascinated. I looked at Seth. His jaw was hanging loose, his eyes bulging. Hammersley's mouth was set in a tight, clenched line, his eyes like fire in his blue, drawn face. I couldn't see the other. The telephone caught me, and in no time at all, I was convicted. The date set for the hanging. When my time was pretty close, a doctor, some scientist fellow, came to see me who said, "Blackett, you're slated to die. How much do you sell me your body for?" If he didn't say it that way, he meant just that. And I said, "Nothing. I have no one to leave money to. What do you want with what do you want with my body?" And he tells me, "I can bring you back to life and health, provided they don't snap your neck when they drop you." "You're one of those guys," I said then. "All right, up to it. If you can do it, I'll be much obliged. Then I can go back on that farm doing a little more axe swinging." Again came his horrible chuckle, and again I mopped my brow. "So we made our plans," he went on, pleased with our discomfiture and our despising of him. "Next day some chap came to see me, pretending he was my brother. I carried out my part of it by cursing him at first, then begging him to give me a decent burial. So he went away, and I supposed received permission to get me right after I was cut down. There's a fence built around the scaffold they had ready for me, and the party I was about to fling, they had some militia there too. The crowd seemed quiet enough till they led me out. and their buzzing sounded like a hive of bees getting all stirred up. And a few loud voices, then shouts. Some rocks came flying at me after that. Looked to me as though the hanging wouldn't be a very gentle party after all. I'll tell you, I was afraid. I wished it was over. The mob pushed against the fence and flattened it out, coming over it like waves over a beach. Soldiers fired into the air, but they still came, and I ran up onto the scaffold. It was safer. As he said this, he chuckled loudly. I'll bet that's the first time a guy ever ran into the news of the safety of it. The mob came only to the foot of the scaffold. They seemed satisfied to see the law take its course. The sheriff was nervous, so cut up he only made a fling at tying my ankles. Just dropped a rope around my wrists. He was like me, he wanted to get it over, the crowd on its way. And he put the rope around my neck, stepped back, and shot the trap. That was that. No time for a prayer, for me to laugh at the offer, or last word, or anything. Felt the floor give, felt myself shoot through, smack. My weight on the end of the rope hit me behind the ears like a mallet. Everything went black. Of course, it would have been just my luck to get a broken neck out of it, give that scientist no chance to revive me. But after a second or two, or a minute, or could have been an hour, blackness went away enough to know me I was hanging on the end of the rope, kicking, fighting, choking to death. My tongue swelled my face and head and heart. Body seemed ready to burst. Slowly I went into a deep mist that I knew was the mist, and then I was off floating in the air over the heads of the crowd, watched my own hanging. I saw them give that slowly swinging carcass on the end of the rope time enough to thoroughly die. Then from my aerial, unseen watching place, I saw them cut it, well, me, down. Tried the pulse of the body that had been mine. They examined my staring eyes, heard him pronounce me dead. I'd known I'd been dead for a minute or two by that time. That's how my spirit could have been gone and floating around over their heads. He paused here as he asked his question, his head turning on its dry and creaking neck to include us all in his query. But none of us spoke. We were dreaming it all, of course. Or were mad, we thought. In just a short while, went on the skeleton, my brother came driving in slowly for my body. With no special hurry, he loaded me onto his little truck and drove easily away. But once he was clear of the crowd, he pushed his foot down on the gas, and 5 more minutes, with me hovering over all the while, alongside of him, mind you, floating along as though I'd been a bird, turned into a driveway of a summer home. A scientific-looking guy met him, carried me into the house, into a fine-fitted laboratory. My dead body was placed on a table, and a huge knife ripped my clothes from me. Quickly, the loads from 10 or a dozen hypodermic syringes were shot in different parts of my body. Then it was carried across the room what looked like a large glass bottle or a vase, with an opening in the top. I was lowered through this door, my body held upright by straps, and there for that purpose. The door to the opening was placed in position, and they used a torch and some melting glass to seal that door up tight. So there stood my poor old body, ready for the experiment to bring it back to life. As my new self floated around above the scientist and his helper, I smiled. I was sure the experiment would prove a failure, even though I now knew the sheriff's haste had kept him from placing the rope right. He'd saved me a broken neck. I was dead. All that was left of me was my soul. And that was swimming and floating about above their heads. Not an inclination in the world to have a thing to do with the husk of the man I could see through the glass of the bell. Then they turned on a huge battery of ultraviolet rays. The scientist explained to me in prison it acts upon the contents of the syringes. At that time they'd gone through my whole body, and it was to renew the spark of life within the dead thing hanging there. Through a tube and by means of a valve entering the glass vase in the top, the scientist then emitted a dense white gas. So thick it was that in a moment my body's transparent coffin seemed to be full of a liquid as white as milk. Electricity then revolved the cage, so that my body was ensured a complete and even exposure to the rays of the green and violet lamps. While all this silly stuff was going on around and around the laboratory, I floated, confident of the complete failure of the whole thing, determined to see it through, if for no other reason than to see the discomfort and disappointment that this mere man was bound to experience. I was already looking back on these mortals as inferior, and I waited for this proof. I was all the while fighting off an urge to be going somewhere. Something was calling me, beckoning me, coming to the full spirit world. But I wanted to see this wise old earth guy fail. For a little while, conditions stayed the same within that glass. So thick was that gas in there, at first I couldn't see a thing. Then it started clearing up, and I saw that the milky gas was disappearing, because it was being forced in by the rays, through the pores of my body itself. It seemed like I was sucking it in like a sponge. The scientist and his helper were tense and taut with excitement. Suddenly my comfortable feeling left me. Until then it seemed so smooth and velvety and peaceful, drifting around over their heads like almost lying on a cloud. But now I felt a sudden squeeze and grip my spirit body. Then I was in an agony. Before I knew what I was doing, my spirit was clinging to the outside of that glass bell, clawing to get into the body. It was coming back to life. The glass now was perfectly clear of the gas. There was no sign of life in the body yet. To hint to the scientist, he was right, but I knew it. I fought desperately to break in through the glass to get back into my body again, knowing I gotta get in or die a worse death than I had before. Then my sharper eyes noted a slight shiver passing over the white thing before me. The scientist must have seen it in the next second, for he sprang forward with a choking cry of delight. Then the head lifted inside a bit. I was still desperately clinging with my spirit hands to the outside, all the time growing weaker and weaker. I saw the chest of my body rise and fall. The assistant picked up a steel hammer and stood ready to crash open the glass at the right moment. Then my once dead eyes opened in there to look around, while I was clinging and gasping outside. Just as I had on the scaffold, went into a deeper, darker blackness than ever. Just before my spirit life died, I saw the eyes of my body realize completely what was going on. Then from the inside now, I saw the scientist give the signal, cause the assistant to crash away that glass shell with one blow of his hammer. Then they reached in for me and I fainted. When they came back to consciousness, I was being carefully, slowly revived, nursed back to life by an oxygen and a pulmotor. The terrible creature telling us this tale paused again to look around. My knees were weak and my clothes were wet with sweat. "Is that all?" I asked in a piping, strange voice, half sarcastic, half unbelieving, and completely spellbound. "Just about. What do you expect?" I left my friend the scientist at once, even though he did hate to see me go. It'd been alright when he was so keen on the experiment himself, while he only half believed it to bring me back. But now that he'd done it, it kind of worried him. Think what sort of a guy he was turning loose on the world again. I could see how he was figuring. And because I had no idea of letting him try another experiment on me, perhaps of putting me away again, I beat it in a hurry. That was 5 years ago. For 5 years I've lived with only just part of me here. Whatever it was trying to get back into that glass just before my body came to life, but my spirit I've been calling it. I've been without. I never did get back. Scientists brought me back inside a shell that kept my spirit out. That's why I'm the skeleton you see I am. Something vital's missing. He stood up, cracking and creaking before us, buttoning his loose coat about his angular body. "Well, boys, what do you think of that?" "I think you're a liar. And if you don't want me to fill you full of lead, get out of here. Get out now. If I have to do it to you, there's no scientist this time to bring you back. When you go out, you stay out." "Don't worry." He grimaced back to me, waving a mass of bones that should have been a hand contemptuously at me. "I'm going. Headed for Shelton." He stalked the length of the floor and shut the door behind him, and the beast had gone.
The dirty liar. I wish I had an excuse to kill him. Just think of being that loose, will you? A brute who'd think up such a yarn. Of course, it's absurd, it's crazy, it's a lie.
No, it's not a lie.
I turned to see who had spoken. Hammersley's voice was so unfamiliar and now so torn, in addition, that I couldn't have thought he was the one who'd spoken, had he not been looking right at me, his eyes challenging my assertion. Would wonders never cease? I asked myself. First this outrageous yarn, now Hammersley, the Sphinx, expressing an opinion, looking for an argument. It must be that his susceptible and brooding brain had been turned a bit by the evening we'd just experienced. Hammersley, you don't believe this, do you?
I not only believe it, Jerry,
But now it's my turn to say, as he did, I know it. Jerry, old friend, that devil told the truth. He was hanged. He was brought back to life, and Jerry, I was that scientist. I fell back to the box again. My knees seemed to forsake me, and I heard Hammersley talking to himself. 5 years it's been. 5 years since I've turned him loose again. 5 years of agony for me, wondering what devilish crimes he was perpetrating, wondering when he'd return to that little farm to swing his axe again. 5 years. 5 years. He came over to me, and without a word of explanation, or to ask my permission, he reached his hand into my pocket and drew out my revolver. I didn't protest. He said he was headed for Shelton. Went on Hammersley's spoken thoughts. If I slip across the ice, I can intercept him at Black's Woods. Buttoning his coat closely, he followed the stranger out into the night. I was glad the moon had come up for my walk home. Glad, too, when I had the door locked and propped with a chair behind me. I undressed in the dark, not wanting any grisly, sunken-eyed monster to be looking in through the window at me. For maybe, so I thought, maybe he was, after all, not headed for Shelton, but perhaps planning on another of his ghastly tricks. But in the morning, we knew he'd been going towards Shelton. Scientists, doctors, and learned men of all descriptions came out to our village to see the thing the papers said C. Waters had stumbled upon on his way to the creamery the next morning. It was a skeleton, they said, only that it had been a dry skin over it. A mummy. Couldn't have been considered capable of containing life, only that the snow around it was blotched with a pale smear that proved to be blood, that oozed out from 6 bullet holes in the chest. They never did solve it. There were 5 of us in that store that night. 5 of us who knew. Hammersley did what we all wanted to do. Of course his name really isn't Hammersley, but it's done here as well as another. He's a black-whiskered man, though, and he's still very much of a sphinx, but he'll never have to answer for having killed the man he brought back to life. Hammersley's secret will go into 5 other graves besides his own. That one was a real trip. Holy cow. Oh, I'm very tempted to just leave it there. But I think I'm going to go for one. Actually, let's see how long this one is. Hang on. I want to see how long this is. So take a note. We're on the Monsters of Moyen. Ooh, and then we have a something a little different. We have a reader's corner. That's neat. So after the Monsters of Moyen, we have the reader's corner. That's 30% later. Hang on. Yeah. So we would have to read 28% of the book in half an hour. I don't think I want to do that. So we'll come back to the Monsters of Moyen next week. Monsters of Moyen by Arthur J. Burks. Look forward to that one next week, folks. I had a great time doing this, as I usually do. Sorry, it's a little late. I was just dozing off on Friday. I didn't want to give you a subpar episode. I'm still working out on how I should sleep during school. So if you give me a moment, I'm going to look through the Twitch. I'm going to end off the recording here for the folks who are listening at home. So for the folks who are listening at home, this has been Paper Cuts, and I hope it didn't sting.